The Salem witch trials resulted in witchcraft accusations against more than 150 people and the executions of 20. But when we talk about the enslaved people caught up in the crisis, history usually remembers only one name, Tituba. She is the first face we see in the crucible, the first to confess, and the figure who looms largest in the mythology of 1692. But she wasn't the only enslaved woman who faced the magistrates that year. Welcome to The Thing About Salem. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack. Today we're telling the story of another enslaved woman from Barbados whose examination became one of the most interesting courtroom proceedings of the summer. A woman who confessed to witchcraft, but on different terms. Her name was Candy.
By July 4th, 1692, the witch trials had been raging. 20 people would eventually be executed. The jails were overflowing. On July 1st, John Putnam Jr. and Thomas Putnam filed a complaint against an enslaved woman and her owner, claiming they were afflicting Ann Putnam Jr., Mary Walcott, and Mary Warren through witchcraft. 3 days later, on that July 4th, the magistrates, Bartholomew Gedney and John Hathorne, with Reverend Nicholas Noyes present, examined a woman who would introduce something different into the proceedings.
Candy was an enslaved woman originally from Barbados who was held in bondage by a woman named Margaret Hawkes. Hawkes herself was described in the complaint as late of Barbados, now of Salem. So both women had made the Atlantic crossing together. The court records describe Candy through the colonist's lens as Negro. Interestingly, Tituba also came from Barbados but was described in the records as Indian or Spanish Indian. It's worth noting that these ethnic designations reflect the court's perceptions and categories, not necessarily actual ancestry or how they would have identified themselves.
That origin detail, Barbados, matters to how this examination unfolds. Barbados was a major sugar colony in the English Atlantic world, with brutal conditions for enslaved people. The island had a large enslaved African population, and it was a cultural crossroads where African, indigenous, and European traditions collided. Candy was about to introduce physical objects into the courtroom, but first the magistrates asked her the standard question, "Are you a witch?"
She confessed, but she made a very specific distinction. Speaking in third person, her words were recorded as, Candy, no witch in her country. Candy's mother, no witch. Candy, no witch, Barbados. This country, mistress, give Candy witch.
So what does that statement mean in the context of a Puritan worldview? New England was supposed to be the city upon the hill, a godly society, a beacon of Christian virtue. And here's an enslaved woman from Barbados testifying that this society, not her Barbadian home, was the corrupting influence. It's a direct indictment of the colony. She told them that their Massachusetts made her wicked.
Candy was enslaved and she had no legal rights, and she was facing men who had the power to condemn her to death. Confessing was a strategy during the trials, but the content of her confession is significant. She didn't simply say, yes, I am a witch. She created a narrative that placed responsibility on the Puritan colony itself.
When asked how her mistress made her a witch, Candy testified that her mistress brought a book, pen, and ink and made her write in it. The magistrates asked what she wrote. According to the record, she took a pen and ink and upon a book or paper made a mark. This detail connects her testimony to the common accusation pattern, the devil's book, where witches supposedly signed their names. But Candy placed the book in her mistress's hands, not the devil's.
The magistrates then demanded proof. They wanted her to produce the instruments of her witchcraft. Candy offered them something tangible. The magistrates told her to go get them, so she left the courtroom and returned with her instruments.
What did she bring back? Here's where our sources diverge slightly. The examination record transcribed by Governor Thomas Hutchinson mentions 2 clouts, pieces of cloth, one with 2 knots tied in it, the other with 1 knot. But Reverend John Hale, writing in his 1702 book, A Modest Inquiry into the Nature of Witchcraft, describes the collection more fully based on what he was credibly informed about: a handkerchief with several knots, rags of cloth, a piece of cheese, and a piece of grass.
To the court, these objects were instruments of magic that needed to be tested.
The magistrates conducted a folk magic experiment right there in the courtroom. According to the examination record attested by Magistrate John Hathorne, when Candy showed the knotted cloths, Mary Warren, Deliverance Hobbs, and Abigail Hobbs fell into violent fits. The afflicted claimed that the black man and Mrs. Hawks and Candy were pinching them through these puppets.
Then the magistrates set the rags on fire. As the fabric burned, these afflicted girls began to choke and gasp for air, acting as if they themselves were being burned or suffocated by the smoke. In the logic of spectral evidence, this validated the connection between the physical objects and spiritual affliction. The examination record notes that when the knots were untied, the afflicted continued suffering. And a bit of one of the rags being set on fire, the afflicted all said they were burned and cried out dreadfully.
They then turned to the grass. According to Hale's account, the magistrates compelled Candy to eat, or as he put it, some compelled her to swallow, the piece of grass. The entire courtroom watched this. Think about what this moment represents. The most powerful men in the colony forcing an enslaved woman to eat grass to prove a supernatural claim.
It infuriates me. Candy later testified that after eating the grass, she felt a burning sensation in her stomach. Hale writes that she said she was burned in her flesh. The records don't allow us to know certainly what it meant, but it provided the court with what they considered empirical evidence of witchcraft.
The examination record also describes another test. The rags being put into water, two of the aforenamed persons were in dreadful fits, almost choked, and the other was violently running down to the river, but was stopped. The magistrates were systematically testing each object Candy had brought in.
The court wanted evidence of magic. They wanted confirmation that Candy was a dangerous outsider. She provided mundane household items, a handkerchief, rags, cheese, grass, and identified them as instruments of power.
Candy didn't limit her confession to herself. She implicated Margaret Hawks, claiming that Hawks had made her a witch when she said, "My mistress in this country made me a witch." That's who she met, Margaret Hawks. And this testimony matters. An enslaved person accusing their own owner represented a significant disruption of the social order. Margaret Hawks was charged with witchcraft and arrested at the same time as Candy.
Candy was indicted on 2 counts for afflicting Ann Putnam Jr. and for afflicting Mary Walcott. She was imprisoned in the Salem jail. Those conditions were so severe. No heat in the winter, poor ventilation in the summer, limited food, disease, chains. Candy endured this imprisonment for months.
But she survived. When the Court of Oyer and Terminer was dissolved and the trials wound down, Candy was tried by the Superior Court of Judicature on January 6, 1693, and a jury heard both indictments, heard the evidence and examinations, heard her defense. The foreman was Richard Gross. The verdict? Not guilty on both counts. The court ordered that Candy, the Negro servant above said, to be discharged, paying her fees.
Those fees had to be paid for her to be discharged, but we don't have a record of that. Candy now disappears from the historical record. We don't know if she stayed in Massachusetts or was sold elsewhere. We don't know if she remained enslaved to Margaret Hawks. What the records do show us is that on July 4th, 1692, an enslaved woman from Barbados stood in a Salem court and testified that Massachusetts, not Barbados, had made her a witch. She presented cheese and grass as magical instruments. She implicated her owner. She survived months in the dungeon and was eventually acquitted.
The Salem witch trials weren't isolated from the broader Atlantic world. They were shaped by slavery, by colonialism, by the collision of different cultural traditions.
The documents regarding Candy's examination are available in records of the Salem witch hunt. The original examination transcript, the indictments, and the trial record all survive.
Thank you for joining us on The Thing About Salem. Candy's testimony speaks across more than 3 centuries, reminding us that the accused were not passive victims. They were people making choices within impossible circumstances, using whatever resources they had available. Join us next week as we examine another story from 1692.